start because we're already a bit late. So the next speaker is Feras Saad from MIT, and so he's gonna talk about domain-specific probabilistic programs, and in particular about scalable structure for learning and inference on these. Please.
Okay, great. So thank you for the invitation. It's very nice to see lots of familiar faces, or familiar names at least. So I'll start the talk by motivating why we're interested in learning the structure of domain-specific probabilistic programs, then discuss structural learning and fast exact inference, and conclude with a research roadmap. So here's an example where we're seeing a video of zebrafish hunting prey. This seemingly simple process involves many cognitive behaviors, such as visual perception, object recognition, decision-making, and motor control. Since we don't have a mechanistic model of the zebrafish brain, we might be interested in discovering a phenomenological model of these observed cognitive behaviors. These learned models could then help us explain and predict how they map to neural activity in the brain. So here's another example where, suppose you're a data analyst at an airline company building pricing models. Then you know that demand for airline tickets has seasonal behavior with an overall linear trend that's been increasing over time for the last several decades. However, in early 2020, something known as COVID happened, which caused a huge shock to the system and sent airline demand crashing. A standard statistical model of seasonal time series is not robust to this kind of extreme novelty. And so we wonder if it's possible to build techniques that learn not only parameters of a fixed model, but quickly detect and adapt to changes in the underlying structure. As a final example, we're interested also in making sense of data that not only arises from the natural world, but potentially from algorithms' behavior. A growing number of key decision-making processes, such as job recruiting, have begun to incorporate AI for more automation or accuracy. However, there's a lot of research that shows these algorithms can make systematically unfair recommendations against groups such as women or minorities. Here, we might be interested in first learning a model for how resumes and qualifications are distributed within each group in the population, and then do inference as to whether the decision algorithm is fair with respect to that distribution. So in all these applications, we can think of the question and the model detail that's needed to answer that question as lying on a spectrum. In the simple case, we might try to describe the data or explore structure. Going one step further, we could aim to make inferences about observed data or make predictions of future data. And most ambitiously, we might try to discover causal or mechanistic structure to test theories or build models of how the world works. For most of the talk, I'll focus on exploratory, inferential, and predictive science, but it's helpful to have the full map in our minds. So people in this community probably well know that probabilistic modeling and inference gives us a principled approach to doing this kind of analysis in data science. We start by using knowledge of the domain to build a probabilistic model of how that data was generated, which has both latent and observed variables. The goal of probabilistic inference is to take the model, the observed data from the real world, and a query of interest, and return an answer to that query with respect to the model and data. And we saw in the previous slide various types of queries that we might be interested in doing. Once we have these results, we might reflect on them, explore, make decisions, iterate the whole pipeline. So this is very much an iterative process. When we think about scalability, we don't just mean scalability in terms of the size of the data. That's important, but we're also interested in scaling other things, such as the number of domains for which we can easily apply modeling and inference. Even now in LAFI, we've seen people talk about differentiable computing and climate models and Bayesian nonparametrics. So the same pipeline, we'd like to use it for all these different types of domains. Second, within a domain, we'd like to be able to scale the model of complexity needed to explain a data set. We need flexibility to entertain both simple and complex models, regardless of the size of the data. And finally, we're interested in scaling the number of inference queries that we can answer. Is it feasible to ask a broad set of questions using a single iteration of the workflow, or do we need to start from scratch each time we come up with a new query? So now let's talk about probabilistic programming. This probabilistic programming is designed to enable sophisticated modeling and inference workflows by building on two key ideas. We represent models as executable computer programs that make random choices. And we represent key operations on these models as metaprograms, such as querying values of future data, inferring values of latent variables, learning structure and parameters, and analyzing information flow or the goodness of fit of the data to a given model. Great. And as we've already seen throughout today, PPL community is growing and it's being used in a variety of domains, such as scientific simulators, computer vision, random measures, and so on. Broadly speaking, it's helpful to distinguish between two main approaches that different systems take to probabilistic programming. Language with automatic inference will take a user-written probabilistic program representing the model, a data set, and a query, and then it automatically returns an answer to the user. To ensure good performance, these languages typically restrict the class of models that can be expressed. On the other hand, languages with customizable inference make it possible to handle a broader class of models by also allowing expert users to write high-level inference programs as well as the models themselves. So this is a classic trade-off between expressiveness and expertise. However, in both cases, there are two main challenges to probabilistic programming. The first one is how do we construct probabilistic programs for a given domain? Where do they come from? And the second one is how do we do effective and accurate inference? So this talk will cover both, or progress towards, automatically learning entire probabilistic programs from data in various domains and querying these programs in a PPL with fast inference. So the kind of workflow that we're envisioning here is to use the data to build a probabilistic program using program learning techniques. These techniques, or the program learning algorithms, will be specific to data that belongs to a given domain, such as time series, cross-sectional data, relational data, or even a broad class of programs generated by parameters. Once we have these learned probabilistic programs, we can query them in a PPL with fast, exact, and automatic inference to get answers to a broad set of questions. So now let's look at an example of what this is all about. In this plot, the x-axis represents time and the y-axis represents the value of the time series. Just by looking at the data, we can quickly pick up on a few key patterns, such as the values increasing on average, as well as some structure that looks periodic, right? So even just by looking at the data, we already have some hypotheses about the underlying patterns here. Here, I'm showing the same data stream on the right and a collection of learned probabilistic programs on the left, given the fragment of data so far. The domain-specific language, which represents the in which these programs are represented, encodes both temporal patterns that exist, as well as numeric constants such as slopes, amplitude, frequency as noise. Both the structure of the code and the numeric constants are evolving over time. After seeing about half the data, we're able to make very accurate predictions based on the discovered structure. And the reason here we have an ensemble of probabilistic programs is really to reflect uncertainty in the structure. So suppose now I told you that this data represents airline traffic volume, which we saw earlier. Here we're going to inject a change point representing, for example, the crash due to COVID, and check whether the probability of a change point across the ensemble increases and accurately and quickly adapts the learned structure and predictions. And so soon, we should see that the value quickly becomes linearly decreasing. And then once we have that, the system sort of adapts to the new behavior after injecting the novelty. We can also explore performance on other patterns. So here I'm showing a radio wave. Here we have a nested sinusoidal structure where the learning algorithm is able to very accurately represent this nested structure after seeing less than half the outer period. At that point, the predictions become very, very accurate. So we can benchmark the forecasting accuracy of the programming learning methods on several data sets and find that it typically produces lower errors as compared to other fully unsupervised baselines, which can fail to accurately capture the temporal structure. Another sort of valuable output is having posterior probabilities of the existence of various temporal structures, such as lines, trends, change points, noise, and periodicity. Here I'm also showing forecasts in red on future data, which confirms the models both learn meaningful structure, but also can make predictions on future data. So that was just a quick demo of what we mean by learning programs. Let's talk a little bit more formally about this whole idea. The key idea is that for each domain we're interested in modeling, such as time series data, tabular data, relational data, to first design a domain-specific language that describes a broad class of statistical models of data in that domain. I'm denoting the program by a tuple as theta, which represents the model structure and numeric parameters, and we'll see examples. These programs define a distribution over latent variables, which I'm denoting z, and observed variables denoted x. The second component is putting a prior distribution over programs in our domain-specific language. The joint distribution of the random model structure, parameters, latent variables, and observed data factorizes by the chain rule in the usual way. The learning problem is given an observed data set to generate samples from the posterior distribution over all the unknown stuff, which is the unknown structure, parameters, latent variables. By the Bayes rule, this posterior is proportional to the product of the likelihood and the prior. Once we have these posterior samples of structure and parameters, we can think of each learned probabilistic program as defining a distribution over new data using a fixed structure and parameter. We formalize the inference problem as computing probabilities, conditional probabilities or marginal probabilities, as well as generating samples from the learned probabilistic programs. So now let's look at some examples of domains where we've applied this framework, including the demo. We'll start with the demo which we saw earlier. So the first step is defining a domain-specific language for univariate time series. Our starting point is a Gaussian process, which defines a random function over the real line. So here in the plot, I'm showing 4 different random realizations of this function. It's called a Gaussian process because if we fix any list of probe points, the joint distribution is a multivariate Gaussian. The covariance matrix of that Gaussian is derived by what's known as a covariance function, which I'm denoting K. It tells us how the covariance between any, it tells us what the covariance is between any of the value of the function at any 2 probe points. For example, in the plot, if we just fix the time points t and t prime and look at the random values f of t and f of t prime, then they're jointly Gaussian with the covariance given by k of t, t prime. Now, the reason these Gaussian processes are valuable is that they can express a broad class of temporal patterns by modifying the covariance function. In the machine learning community, people have showed that you can start with primitive covariances such as linear trends, periodicity, and smoothness, apply composition rules such as sums and products to produce a broad set of patterns such as periodicities with trends, multi-scale variation. So our goal will be to learn the covariance function. In order to do that, we define a simple domain-specific language for Gaussian process covariance functions. The first row shows a smooth function, and we can see sampled realizations are smooth. The second row shows a sine wave multiplied by a line, which gives us increasing amplitude over time. And the third row shows a change point between a noisy line and a sine wave. In this DSL, we identified the model structure S as the composition operators and the primitive covariance functions in the program, and the model parameters theta as the numeric constants, such as slopes and noise and frequency. We can define the DSL using a simple grammar, which is shown in the first box, and make it a random, and define a distribution over programs in this DSL by assigning probabilities to production rules and probabilities to terminal symbols. In the third box, we're showing the implied distribution over data, which, as we said earlier, is just a multivariate Gaussian once we know the probe points. So let's look at the space of model structures that we're trying to learn. If we consider covariance kernels with only 1 level, there's 4 possibilities for the primitives. With 2 levels, there's now 52 possible structures, which are 4 primitives and 48 compositions. With at most 3 levels, there's 8,000 structures. And by the time we're at 4 levels, we're at 200 million structures. 5 levels is just enormous. And in fact, our prior is giving us an infinite space of possible kernels. And so the distribution is going to be sort of a broad ignorance prior over this infinite space, where increasingly complex structures are penalized more and more by the prior distribution. Now, the reason that our goal is to sample the posterior programs rather than maximize the likelihood is that it's very easy to overfit data given the flexibility of the time series DSL. Here I'm showing 2 plots where the red dots are exactly the same. The left learns a simple noisy sine wave, and the right learns a complex program that interpolates between all the points. Although the noisy sine has a lower data likelihood, it's much more useful for discovering patterns and making predictions. So posterior sampling and using the prior as a regularizer gives us a probabilistically principled way to do this regularization over structure. In our work, we formalized learning not only for Gaussian process domain-specific languages, but any domain-specific language given by a probabilistic grammar. At a high level, the idea is that we do MCMC moves on the structure by choosing a random sub-expression, generating a new expression from a proposal distribution, and accepting rejecting the move based on the usual Metropolis-Hastings rule with transdimensional corrections. We will see that in the coming slide. The previous talk was also about differentiation. We can do map optimization or Hamiltonian Monte Carlo moves on the parameters of a fixed structure by differentiating the likelihood through the DSL program by reverse mode AD. Note that this is only possible when changing numeric parameters doesn't change the structure, which is true for a broad set of PCFGs. Now, implementing all of these in practice is very hard, so I'm going to briefly discuss how we implement program learning using the GEN language. This is a language embedded in Julia, and it's being adopted broadly in industry and academia. People who are interested can also read a recent PhD thesis about GEN. So here, the left code box is showing a prior over model structure and parameters expressed as generative code for the Gaussian process DSL, as well as the multivariate Gaussian distribution over data. On the right, we're showing a proposal program for generating new structures and parameters given the previous state and observed data. Now, as we mentioned earlier, we're doing Markov chain Monte Carlo moves over transdimensional spaces. Doing this correctly needs reversible jump MCMC and involves computing these sort of Jacobian corrections, or in the more general measure theoretic case, a density of this push forward measure. And I think what's really neat is that by using probabilistic programming, users only need to write sort of the involution without having to compute its Jacobian. So users can specify how proposed traces and existing traces map together using short line of code, and then the system will automatically compute the appropriate derivative needed for reversible jump. But it's not only programmability that we gain from using probabilistic programming for program learning. By leveraging static compilation techniques and caching of recursive computations in the grammar, we can obtain speedups that are over 100 times faster than previous languages like Venture, and even faster than hand-coded implementations in Julia. And I'd also just like to point to a direction of current research that I'm really excited about, which is related to the demos I showed. Rather than do MCMC by dumping the whole data set and then trying to do inference, we can do sequential Monte Carlo, where we incrementally add one data point at a time, and then do these involutive or reversible jump MCMC perturbation moves in between adding data. The online learning demos we saw earlier used this sequential algorithm, and we can see that implementing it in probabilistic programming corresponds almost exactly to a transcription of a high-level algorithm into these probabilistic inference algorithms. Using SMC can lead to substantial speedups in practice. The plot here shows the learning runtime versus prediction error on held-out data. While MCMC gets the right answer eventually, using sequential Monte Carlo scales much better. Here, the runtime and accuracy depend on how many perturbation steps we do within the SMC algorithm after adding each batch of data points, usually one data point at a time. So I'm going to take you through now a very quick tour of other domains where we've applied program learning, starting with a multivariate time series, DSL. Using this model, we're showing the flu rates in 4 US regions evolving over time. What we're doing here is finding a joint model where we're hypothesizing the whole system is in a latent state at a given time. We're then using observed data of one time series to find the hidden state, and then using that to make predictions of all the unobserved values in other US regions. At a high level, the way that this prior is working is that we can take a bunch of that time series and have a distribution over how they're factorized, which is detecting independencies between these time series. Then we can fit an independent non-parametric time series model within each block of dependent time series. Here, the color of each time series represents a hidden state which dictates the dynamics of the time series at that given moment in time. The structure learning prior allows us to do very interesting analyses. For example, we can take a data set of GDPs of countries between 1960 and 2010 and discover many common sense patterns like linear growth of GDP over time in developed countries, exponential growth in developing countries like China and Japan, a big change point in the 1990s for Soviet countries, and outliers like North Korea. So here we're using structure learning to fit independent or separate dynamic models to each subset of time series that are represented by similar behaviors. Let's quickly look at a data set, at a DSL for tabular data. So here we just have a standard data matrix where columns represent variables and rows represent observations. Our structure prior will be first to partition, non-parametrically partition or factorize the columns into what we believe are independent groups. And then within each group of dependent columns to learn an infinite mixture model over the rows. And here what I'm showing is online program learning, where the data stream is being expanded on the right. And on the left, I'm showing a probabilistic program that's making forecasts or predictions for future data. And the table here is showing the learned or the inferred factorization of the variables and the non-parametric mixture model that's learned in between. Of course, we can design a simple DSL to apply structural learning proposals, which include sort of moving variables from one block to another, which is hypothesizing that two variables are dependent, and adapting parameters and so forth. Now, one interesting question is sort of what kind of behaviors these learned programs can capture. So here I'm showing a wide set of bivariate nonlinear relations from data sets in the UCI machine learning repository, and we're interested in knowing whether our programs can capture these dependencies. And we find that for the most part, the structure learning prior, the factorization prior is robust to a large set of discrete and continuous types of bivariate structures. We can also compare the simulations from the model to generalized linear models, which are a workhorse in standard statistics. And we find that the simulation from these sort of Bayesian models that we've learned are representing sort of much more accurate replications of the observed data as compared to generalized linear models. Let me very now briefly show a domain-specific language for relational data. In this setting, we're interested in modeling things like random graphs. So here I'm showing an adjacency matrix where each row and column represents a node, and the color of a cell is 0 or 1, representing whether there's an edge between those nodes. The infinite relational model is a very flexible model that allows us to find sort of substructures in networks, where the output is a partition of all the nodes, and the probability that an edge exists between a pair of nodes is only a function of what clusters that they belong to. This simple model can be generalized to model multiple higher order relations, but for this talk, we'll just focus on simple sort of 2D interaction matrices. Our structure prior in this context is to learn a factorization over the relations. So rather than model the entire system using a single infinite relational model, we're going to learn a factorization of the dependencies and learn separate infinite relational models within each block. What this allows us to do is to sort of relax these strong or stringent dependence assumptions in the standard infinite relational model, where by learning structure, we get rid of these spurious clusters due to this sort of combinatorial or this Cartesian product explosion in the face of independence. When we learn structure using with the structure learning prior, we find that on large object attribute data sets with up to 18 million cells, we have better predictive accuracy as compared to the standard infinite relational model, as well as the Dirichlet process mixture model. And it's also interesting that discovering factorization structure can speed up learning. That's because learning factorization there is a cost to learning the factorization, but if we discover simpler models within each independent group, then we have reason to believe that runtime will be faster. And this is what the data here is suggesting. So now let's switch to the second part of the talk, which is, okay, we talked about learning programs in various DSLs. How do we query them? I'm going to briefly talk about the Sum-Product Probabilistic Language that gives us fast, exact answers. As we said earlier, we formalize the inference problem as computing probabilities of events conditioned on other events and simulating condition of variables from condition distributions. What we've implemented is a compiler from probabilistic programs, which is generative code, into representations known as probabilistic circuits. I think these were mentioned briefly in the talk about scientific simulators. But basically, these are compact, sort of deep mixture models that give us the ability to do very effective inference. Once we compile the programs, we can compute probabilities, we can simulate variables, and we can also condition these probabilistic circuits on events, which return a condition distribution that can then be put back into the inference engine to solve queries for simulation and probability computation. Just to give you a high-level intuition of this compilation target is that we're compiling these programs to these sort of deep generative mixture models where a sum node represents a standard probabilistic mixture, a product node represents a factorization, and a leaf node in this computation graph represents a primitive distribution, like a Gaussian, a Poisson, a categorical, could be a multivariate Gaussian. And so any execution of the circuit represents a path down the circuit, shown here in red. So here, one sample execution is shown. The key property is that in any execution, each symbol is visited exactly once at a leaf node, and across all the executions, the same symbols are visited. And so here I'm showing another sample execution of this program, and here's another example. Now, these expressions are useful because there's a lot of work showing that you can do polynomial time inference. They represent sort of well-defined distributions. You can do optimization techniques like factorize them and deduplicate them and represent a rich class of measures like discrete, continuous, and hybrid measures. And as we mentioned earlier, they're closed under conditioning. So the probabilistic programming language we built sort of extends these sum-product networks to handle a range of new constructs that make it more ergonomic to use with probabilistic programming. And we've derived a compiler and optimization techniques for these expressions. This probabilistic programming language is able to express probabilistic programs from the 4 domain-specific languages we saw earlier. It's also able to express most models over discrete variables and decision trees over discrete and continuous variables. Other probabilistic programming constructs that the language can't express are often provably intractable to solve, such as arbitrary Bayes nets, random loops with unbounded number of iterations, or multivariate transformations, which arise in like neural networks or support vector machines. Let's briefly turn into an application of the language for an example we saw in the beginning of the talk, which is assessing the fairness of algorithmic decision-making in hiring. So from the PL community, people have looked at this kind of a problem, where the setup is we have resumes of job applicants, and we use a decision tree to determine whether the applicant should be reviewed by a human or whether it should be thrown away. The fairness query is whether the probability, for example, of hiring a qualified minority, given the probability of rejecting a qualified minority should not be different than the probability of rejecting a qualified non-minority. So our goal is to answer this sort of fairness query about this system, this decision-making system. What we can do is we can take a large data set of previous resumes and use program learning techniques that learns a probabilistic program for generating new resumes. The second step is we can learn a classifier for filtering resumes by looking at a whole history of resumes and whether they were accepted or rejected. These are human labeled decisions, and then train a classifier to reproduce those decisions. Once we have the probabilistic program for generating resumes and a program for filtering resumes, we can compose these and analyze the joint system. So here what I'm going to show is a simple session in the programming language where we're computing the conditional probability that an applicant is a female given they're rejected and comparing it to the prior probability that an applicant is a female. This tells us how much sort of the system is, the decision algorithm is biased against female candidates. And we can see on the first line, we compute the prior probability being a female. On the second line, we're conditioning the model on a reject decision. And this represents a probabilistic inversion of the entire algorithm because the decision is the return value. And so conditioning it computes a posterior distribution over all the hidden values. On the third line, we're querying the condition model to compute the probability the applicant's a female and then computing the ratio. So in this specific case, the system returns that there isn't much of a shift. But obviously, the domain specialist can determine whether this number is satisfactory. Using the probabilistic circuit representation allows us to solve these kind of fairness verification query in milliseconds as compared to previous state-of-the-art solvers. So the speed up factors can be anywhere from 10x to up to 3000x. Here, I'd just like to emphasize that for this benchmark set of fairness verification tasks, we're only focused on decision trees, whereas all these other systems can solve a wider class of models. So this is the classic tension between runtime and expressiveness. As we mentioned earlier, a key enabler of the runtime gains is this closure condition, where conditioning a sum-product expression under an event gives us a new expression, and this is leveraged very broadly in the compiler, which I won't talk about. But roughly, we formalized this process of going from a generative language into a sum-product expression. I'd just like to close by highlighting a few optimizations that are possible to build concise expressions. One is factorization. So this is basically sort of algebraic techniques we learned in high school. They can often be applied to some product expressions. Another optimization technique is deduplication, which is shown on the right. This means that if we can detect that two sub-expressions in the overall expression are identical, then we only ever need to represent that once in memory. The third optimization is memoization. So we can think of the algorithms, the inference algorithms doing top to bottom inference. But once we solve an inference query at a specific sub-expression, if we visit it again, we don't have to traverse the whole sub-expression, but we can memoize. This memoization is a little different than the memoization we saw in previous talks because this doesn't change the semantics because we're doing exact symbolic inference. So there's no, this is only a compiler optimization. There's no semantic consequences of doing memoization in this way. So yeah.
Sorry for us. Yeah, no, just to tell you that you have 5 minutes more or less.
Yeah, we're right on time. So I'd just like to close briefly with a research roadmap for a few future directions that we could take this research. So we've seen that we can learn programs, and we've seen we can query them. But I think that most of the generic techniques we focused are our probabilistic context tree grammars. when we think of DSLs that are not PCFGs, we need to come up with new synthesis algorithms that are specific to DSL, that are specific to the DSL. I think coming up with a richer space of priors may allow us to use reusable inference machinery to scale program learning in terms of the number of domains which we can easily apply it. In terms of inference, I think also this may have been mentioned in a few previous talks, which is using these representations as sum-product expressions for coarse-grained symbolic analysis and data-driven proposals in more general-purpose languages. So this would be sort of hybrid, exact, and approximate inference towards improved scalability. A third direction is sort of investigating whether structured learning can leverage amortized inference. This, I think, is an open question, and I think, I'd be very curious to know what people think of this direction. Another research direction we're investigating is making these techniques broadly accessible to millions of SQL users by integrating program learning and fast exact inference into databases like SQLite, Postgres, etc. And then obviously the last sort of thing we're really interested in is more applications of program learning to real world problems that people care about. So that's all I have for today, and I'm happy to take questions. And I apologize for the video issues. I'm not sure why that didn't work out.
No problem. Thank you, Feras. Thank you. All right. Clap, clap, clap. Lots of claps. Okay, so we already have a question in the chat. Yeah, here it is. So now you should see it for us on the screen.
Fairness can be difficult to define. Sometimes trying to correct certain unfairness can lead to unfairness in other places. How are you addressing this? What are your sources for fairness metrics? It's a very good question. So the scope of the application I showed was sort of for a fixed fairness query, how quickly can we solve it? The question of how do we come up with fairness definitions is something which I think experts in AI ethics are much more capable of answering. I think from the perspective of fast inference, we'd hope that for all the different ways that people define fairness, we're able to give fast and exact answers for those definitions. I think that would really be the goal. And then the AI ethics experts or the domain specialists can determine how to, adapt the definitions, and especially this pitfall that's mentioned in the question, definitely.
All right, thank you. Other questions? Where's this in the chat? Yes, great talk. Yeah, thank you. In fact, any more questions? We still have like 2 minutes. If you don't hesitate. In the meantime, I guess I can ask a curiosity. I mean, it's kind of far from my expertise, so I'm not really. But I was really curious. So the programs you learn, so in the end you compile them into those trees, right? So the structure of these programs it has to be fairly simple, right? I mean, I couldn't see, in the examples you gave, they were too little, too small to actually read the code.
Definitely. Yes.
So what do these programs look like?
Definitely, that's a good question. So here the leaves, you're correct that many of these can be simple, but these leaves, these can represent both tractable parametric probability distributions, but in principle, other probabilistic programs too. So you can think of composing probabilistic programs through these sort of operators. For the actual programs that we're synthesizing, I didn't show the rendering and the language, but roughly for the various domain-specific languages, the learning problem is sort of already solving how do we come up with the program, and then the representation is a sum-product expression. So there's a missing step that I didn't show, which is how do we transfer from a domain-specific program to a program in this language? Mm-hmm. And I think that I think that's something which I didn't really discuss, but I'm happy to talk more about that offline.
All right, sure. Thank you. We still, well, I guess, yeah, it's 8:45 here. So we're at the end of the session. Yes, thank you again for this excellent talk.